Welcome to the ACAPS-NPM Analysis Hub's first audio discussion on household vulnerability in the Rohingya refugee response, part of ACAPS's pilot adapting written reports to audio to make our analysis more accessible to people who don't have time to read text-heavy reports. ACAPS is an independent, non-governmental project that provides global and crisis-level analysis. The ACAPS-NPM Analysis Hub was established in Bangladesh in 2017 and is hosted by IOM's Needs and Population Monitoring Unit, NPM. The hub supports the overall Rohingya response through assessment and analysis support and conducts independent analysis to support evidence-based decision-making. In this first audio report, we will be discussing the key findings of our Household Vulnerabilities Report that was published in October of 2020 and the impact of COVID-19 on these vulnerable households. This session will highlight who the most vulnerable households are and why. And Lamia and I, Xiomara, will be discussing the report and its findings. So, Lamia, when ACAPS saw the data and started picking up on commonalities and writing the piece, what was the aim?
Well, Xiomara, based on qualitative assessment that ACAPS did on vulnerability back in 2019, we started exploring the Joint Multi-Needs Assessment, JMSNA, the REVA, and an unpublished micropolitical economy study, the PMES. We noticed that the data repeatedly suggested that there were particular household types that are consistently identified as more vulnerable. So we wanted to understand why it is that these households have a harder time than other households. After all, everyone in the camps receives a particular level of blanket assistance. We found that, despite humanitarian assistance, all Rohingya refugees are vulnerable. Around 98% of households rely on negative coping mechanisms to meet their daily needs. When we look at the Bangladeshi host community in Cox's Bazar district, another 370,000 Bangladeshis live under the poverty line. However, despite this overall vulnerability, there are specific household types which consistently have a much harder time meeting their basic needs. They also have lower well-being indicators. These are households with less access to public space due to mobility restrictions or social norms, households without access to income and income-generating activities, and households with more or higher expenses.
Right. And which households specifically were found to fall into these categories?
According to the available information in both Bangladeshi and Rohingya communities, there are 3 household types that are more likely to have these challenges and face larger barriers to meet their needs. The first is single female-headed households, especially those households without a male of working age. The second type is households with at least one member aged 5 years and older who requires daily assistance to complete tasks. This could be a person with disabilities, an older person, or someone suffering from chronic illness, especially if they're the head of the household. And the third type is households with large economically vulnerable families with more than 5 members. Among these households, the most vulnerable are single female-headed households without a male of working age. Various assessments identified that these households display lower levels of well-being and greater barriers across more indicators. The Rohingya refugees themselves also consistently identified this household type as the most vulnerable.
That's really interesting. So, why exactly is it that single female-headed households without a working age male are the ones that are the most vulnerable?
Well, there are various reasons for this. Households without a working age male are less likely to participate in income-generating activities. The 2019 MSNA found that 55% of Rohingya households with a male of working age engaged in income-generating activities, compared to only 8% of households without a male of that age. And the Micropolitical Economies Assessment found that Rohingya male households were 3 times more likely to have a member working as an NGO volunteer than single female-headed households. This is mainly due to sociocultural norms and the fact that there are fewer work opportunities that are appropriate for women. Many jobs require some violation of social norms, like parda, for example, as they are considered masculine and require women to leave the house and travel through the camps or work alongside men. Small social networks are also an issue. In the camps, income-generating activities are often advertised through word of mouth or written messages in public spaces. Women generally have less access to public spaces and have smaller social networks. They also tend to have lower levels of literacy and are more likely to only speak Rohingya. So when job opportunities are advertised or communicated in other languages or in public spaces, they may not even know that they're there. Additionally, the burden of childcare falls on women, and especially women without a male of working age. These women are often unable to work if they cannot bring their children with them. Among Bangladeshis, livelihood opportunities for female-headed households and households with no males aged 18 to 59 are minimal. The 2019 JMSNA found a huge discrepancy between the proportion of women working, only 4%, and the proportion of men working, which is 47%. For women who do work, there is a significant gender pay gap.
Okay. So you've told us what makes them more vulnerable, but what does this actually mean for these families?
A lack of access to income or income-generating activities means that a household simply has fewer resources to draw on if something goes wrong or to supplement humanitarian assistance. The humanitarian assistance provided in the camps doesn't quite meet all of people's basic needs, so households need to supplement their assistance. The households we identified in particular struggle to supplement that assistance. And a lot of households in the camps do pay for medical assistance. They might also need to repair their shelters if something breaks or buy additional food. Households that can supplement their assistance are better able to absorb shocks and rely less on negative coping mechanisms. However, these households who have little or no income find that if something does come up, they need to rely on negative coping mechanisms to make ends meet. This could mean selling some of their assistance or borrowing from others. This actually means that vulnerable households end up with less assistance in comparison to others because they're having to sell it to meet other needs.
And are there other issues that make being a single female-headed household without a working-age male so challenging?
Both Bangladeshi and Rohingya women and girls in the camps struggle with safe access to public facilities and services. Moving around the camps and public spaces is very difficult. For the Rohingya, parda and other socio-cultural norms also decrease their mobility. This makes it harder for them to access assistance or reach services because doing so often requires lining up with men. The weight of the packages of food, non-food items, and water is also a problem. Women and girls also face higher rates of sexual and gender-based violence and harassment, putting them at risk whenever they leave their shelters. And for Bangladeshi households, the increase in people in and around their communities and the accompanying rise in criminality prevents many women and girls from feeling safe enough to go out.
So, Lamia, we've talked about single female-headed households without a working-age male, and that's really important, but you also mentioned two other household types earlier. What are the issues that are faced by households with a large number of dependents or households with people who need additional support to carry out daily tasks? I imagine that because these two groups are not gendered, some of the sociocultural norms that you just raised are not really barriers. So what makes these two groups more vulnerable?
Well, various assessments have found that these households are generally more expensive to run, either because they require more food, water, and items in their house, or because of the cost of medicine. They simply need more income and more services to run their household. It sounds counterintuitive that larger households have less money because, in theory, they have more people who can work. But actually, the micropolitical economy assessment found that in the camps, as household size increases, wealth per capita decreases because the cost outweighs their ability to earn. This is because there are caps on how many members from a household can access income-generating activities. In the data, you can really see the difference, especially with households with 10 to 12 or more members. They report having the highest need for cash for additional expenses and are more likely to report that their assistance is running out faster. It's the same for households with a person who needs additional support or regular medical support. Sometimes the treatment they require is not available at the free humanitarian clinics. So these households have to pay for care and thus tend to have higher medical costs. They also have fewer members that are able to work. This is the same for Bangladeshi host community because of the level of care needed. They have access to clinics both in and outside the caps. According to the 2019 MSNA, larger Bangladeshi households are also less likely to have sufficient access to water.
Okay, so from what I understand, households without a working age male are vulnerable because of the sociocultural norms that prevent the full integration of women in income generating activities, and also the safety concerns and the issues around childcare. Whereas for households with at least one member over the age of 5 requiring assistance, or for the larger economically vulnerable families with more than 5 members, it's much more around the cost of running the household, right? So I've been wondering, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on these households? The studies that you used were conducted before COVID. So is there more recent data to back this up and to suggest that these categories are still the most vulnerable, especially given that the pandemic affected everyone really, really badly?
Because of COVID-19 related restrictions, limited data collection exercises were done, and increased hardship among both Rohingya and Bangladeshis, as you said, makes it more difficult to identify varying levels of vulnerability. There's just so much need, so it's hard to figure out who is having a harder time. For example, containment measures resulted in an estimated 66% drop in Rohingya households participating in income-generating activities. So even those who had access to these activities and were able to supplement their assistance now don't. This left households economically vulnerable and reliant on negative coping mechanisms to fulfill their basic needs. It's also worth pointing out that the Bangladeshis in the host community do not receive blanket assistance, so the shock of COVID-19 affected their access to income. Multiple studies mentioned drastic drops in access to income and earnings throughout COVID-19, but especially during lockdown. When we combine research done pre-COVID-19 and the many small-scale studies that were done during COVID-19, we think that households that were already struggling before COVID are now even worse off, both because of COVID-19 containment measures and because their pre-existing vulnerability makes them less able to absorb shocks. Many assessments conducted during the COVID-19 response found that both the Rohingya and Bangladeshis report increased barriers in accessing of services and assistance. There's a deterioration in safety and security and an increase in risks such as eviction, forced and/or exploitative labor, and trafficking. The urban assessment conducted by WFP in Cox's Bazar Shodor during COVID-19 found that nearly half of all female-headed households in Cox's Bazar municipality were highly vulnerable, compared to a quarter of male-headed households. This was due to a number of things: the discriminatory nature of the labor market, the differential effects of lockdown-induced movement restrictions on women, and cultural factors.
Interesting. Are there any larger scale studies that you can draw from?
Well, there was a JMSNA in 2020. The response was able to run a modified version of the multi-sector needs assessment, and the initial data suggests that the household types that we identified are having an extremely difficult time and are still some of the most vulnerable households. For example, Rohingya households without a male of working age. The MSNA found these households were significantly more likely to have adopted food-based coping strategies and emergency coping mechanisms. They were spending less on food and essential non-food items and relying more on family and community for support to meet food needs. Bangladeshi households without adult males were significantly more likely to rely on food rations and/or family and friends and relatives to meet their main food needs. They were also reporting higher levels of mobility challenges and lower levels of employment. Both Bangladeshi and Rohingya households with disabled members or a member requiring additional daily support were significantly more likely to adopt emergency coping strategies than their peers. Large Bangladeshi households were significantly more likely than smaller households to report having adopted emergency coping strategies such as selling labor in advance.
These are all really interesting findings, Lamia, and it's really interesting to have everything raised this way. But what do you want us to do with this? What would you like to see happen as a result of this data and of the pulling out of these characteristics of vulnerability so clearly? What can the humanitarian response do with this information?
Well, there needs to be a more response-wide programming specifically tailored to support extremely vulnerable Rohingya households, in addition to large-scale blanket programming at the household level. There are already a lot of small-scale initiatives in the camps trying to reach these households, but the data suggests that more needs to be done, and it also suggests that more and more nuanced research is needed about vulnerability in both population groups, and especially research into vulnerable households and their use of coping mechanisms. Very limited research has been done in host communities around vulnerabilities and coping mechanisms. Given the impact of COVID-19 on everyone, we also need more research on how the pandemic has impacted the behavior of these households and their ability to meet their needs. This will help humanitarians develop a better understanding of how to provide tailored support to the different household types, both Rohingya and Bangladeshi. More research on intersectoral needs, coping mechanisms, and behaviors is also needed. This could really help humanitarians develop more holistic projects and program responses.
Thanks, Lamia. Super informative. The full report, called A Thematic Review of Household Vulnerability in the Rohingya Refugee Response, is available on the ACAPS website. The report includes all of our sources, our methodology, and the limitations of our analysis. Please visit www.acaps.org for more information and to sign up to the ACAPS Bangladesh mailing list to receive our reports directly into your inbox as they're released. Our next pilot audio will focus on understanding age and disability programming in the humanitarian response. After the production of these pilot audio reports, we will be sharing a short post-pilot survey with the response. It would be very helpful if you as a listener were to fill it in, but if you would like to provide any feedback before the survey is distributed, please contact me, Xiomara, at xhc@acaps.org. Thank you for listening.